Marangare nadu yinjimara ioramai nadu yinjimara garigol gare Nuremberg. Welcome to Q&A. I wanted to pay my respects to the people of the Eora Nation and the land of the Gadigal people on where we're meeting tonight. If we ban the Nazi salute, what else needs to go? And life on other planets, what does it teach us about this one? We've got some very big thinkers on our panel. World-renowned physicist and best-selling author Brian Greene, who is about to tour Australia. Independent MP for Fowler, Dai Lee, the first independent to hold that seat. Minister for Defence Personnel and Veterans Affairs, Matt Keogh. Wiradjuri woman and science communicator Kirsten Banks. And human rights lawyer, academic author and broadcaster Geoffrey Robertson. We're also going to be asking you, should gambling be banned? Hello, I'm Stan Grant. Thank you so much for that welcome. Remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView and all the socials. Quanda is the hashtag, so please get involved. A little later, we've got a terrific hypothetical for Geoffrey Robertson. Just reversing this, Geoffrey. You're the one now going to put through the hypotheticals. But to get us started tonight, here's a question from Eric Tubin.
Yeah, g'day. Can anyone explain what we saw in Melbourne on the weekend in regards to the Nazi salute, and how is that okay?
Matt.
Well, I almost can't explain it because I think all of us were really quite shocked, Eric, by what we saw in Melbourne. I think across Australia and indeed wherever that would have been seen around the world, to think that well into the 21st century, well after the Second World War, that we would see Australian people making that sort of sign and conveying that sort of message was not just shocking, it was deeply disturbing and of course very offensive. And so whilst we are very fortunate to live in a country that has freedom of speech and freedom of political expression, and we allow people to protest peacefully, and all of those things should be protected. What we saw displayed in Melbourne over the weekend, I think, has really troubled people, and understandably, and that's why I think we've seen now today the Dan Andrews government react in the way that they have around legislating against this.
There's various legislation in other states, and of course there's been legislation or laws against Nazi insignia. What about at a federal level? Is something needed?
Well, I think it's something that fits within the remit of state governments to do, so it probably doesn't need an additional overlay. It's not something that I have looked at, to be honest, Grant, but if there's a gap, then we would need to look at that. But it's that sort of activity is something that would generally fit in the remit of state parliaments.
Di, how did you feel watching that on the weekend?
Look, I think it was quite troublesome, as the Minister said. We do have the anti-discrimination law in Australia. I think that it's in 2023, and we still have that. I think the people who did that were very irresponsible, and I think that we should not obviously accept that, and we should speak out about that.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be outlawed, right? I mean, when you start limiting freedom of speech, that's a slippery slope, which at some point in the future can so easily be turned to suppress the minority. It's not about outlawing it. It's about public shaming it. It's about educating the young so that as they grow up, they don't do it. I mean, what's more powerful, outlawing it or having, say, a 15-year-old daughter see her father on the news undertaking this act and saying, "Dad, oh my God, was that you?" What's more powerful? It's really education. It's not outlawing.
Brian is a Jewish person as well. Person of Jewish
I
heritage.
am Jewish, but I'm not saying this as a Jewish person. I'm saying this as a human being.
So you're saying it as an American. America doesn't.
That's exactly right.
You ask a German, they ban Nazi insignia because they lived under the Nazis. You ask any countryman from Europe, they ban it. Britain doesn't. But gosh, when you're a judge, you can increase the sentence if there's a race-related motive.
Should it be banned, though,
You've got to
Geoffrey?
be very careful in drafting your law, because you have to, otherwise you're going to be banning Charlie Chaplin and the Great Dictator.
Yeah.
So it's not easy. And what is important is that
you can draft something that goes to outlawing something that is such a hateful act,
if
represents
it's
something.
intended to cause hatred.
So how do you do that effectively?
Well, you just say intended to cause hatred in your law. But I think we need to go further. There were 30 young men in black, total black, in front of the Victorian Parliament. Be nice to know where they came from. Are they the St Kilda young liberals imitating Mr Perrottet when he was 20? We don't. So be careful what you wish for in this. We need to tackle the causes that are producing, from under a rock, these people. And interestingly enough, it was in support of someone who was ratcheting up hatred against trans people. And I think that's the key. If you need Nazis to support your cause, it's a rotten cause.
I'll just come to Kirsten. This is my best want to pursue this with you, Geoffrey, as well, because we know that there are bans at a state or territory level against public displays of Nazi symbols. It exists in New South Wales. That come into force in 2022. Queensland government plans to introduce proposed laws to ban Nazi symbols as well, including tattoos. Other states are looking at this. It does then raise the question, what else, doesn't it? For instance, you talked about the United States. Does a Confederate flag, which can be so associated with slavery and racism, a symbol that the Ku Klux Klan used, also be banned? Does that also raise that question, Geoffrey?
Yes, of course. And America has dealt with it on the whole sensibly when Trump left office, and is now moving a lot of these old statues to museums where they belong as part of the history of racism in America. And one could say it in Australia, where our history of racism, going back to the founding fathers, who they all thought like Pauline Hanson, and they were, the first law they ever passed was the White Australia policy, and you had people like Alfred Deakin, who actually told the country that Aboriginals would be erased
Within 100 years.
No more tinted people. So that was the
Well, that didn't
kind
work.
of people.
It didn't work. We're here,
Didn't
Kirsten.
work. We're
We're
still
here. So how do you feel about that as a Wiradjuri woman, taking into account what we saw on the weekend, what Geoffrey has to say, but also the point that Brian made, that banning it may not be the way to go?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because I did want to come back to what you said, Brian, is making I guess, a mockery of these people, yes, a very good learning opportunity for those watching, but why are we letting it get to that point? Why aren't we stopping it before these things kind of happen, so we don't have these big spectacles and we don't have people walking the streets fearing for their lives? And if you look at the footage, who was being protected that day? That's a really big question that I think is really important here too. You look at the footage and it's the people who are being directly threatened with their lives who are being pushed away, and didn't look like they were actually being protected by the police force that were there.
I'll put that to Brian, just in response to that, if it's who deserves protection, I suppose? People protected from hateful symbols and hate speech, or people's right to actually express those views?
Unfortunately, both. Because the only way that you can have a true democracy is if you protect hateful speech, as long as it's not immediately inciting illegal act, as long as it's not immediately inciting some kind of destructive activity. But beyond that, it's through education. It's through the cultural environment that you want to change attitudes so that there isn't an uprising of that sort. That's a more powerful and more lasting approach than just making a ban. Because if you make a ban, you're not changing the hearts and minds of the very people whose act you are now trying to ban. They've got the same mindset, and in fact, for some, it'll fire them up and have more who want to follow in their footsteps merely because they want to go against the authority, the legislative ban. So there's an underlying problem, and that's what needs to be addressed more systemically than just saying, let's ban the activity.
I'll just go back to Eric, because Eric, this is something that's close to your family as well. Your father had lived through Nazi occupation.
Yeah, so he was a Dutch teenager and got sent to a labour camp in Germany during World War II. And he never forgot the war.
How do you feel on that question? We've raised both sides of this, whether banning it is a right idea or the wrong idea. Where do you land?
Not being rude to the gentleman next to you, but I think Australia's a little bit smarter. Like, we've got our issues in Australia, and I understand he doesn't want to ban it, but I don't know. Like, have a look at the equality in the room here. Like, I feel Australian cities, we get on pretty well.
So we could do without that, in your view? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for the question. It certainly got the conversation started, and no doubt a lot of conversation at home about that as well. Later on, we're going to be talking about gambling, another big issue, which has been a dominant issue in the lead up to the New South Wales election. It's the topic of our online poll tonight. Now, here's what we're asking you. Very simply, should gambling be banned in Australia? You can cast your votes on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. We'll bring you the results a little bit later. Now to a topic that's dominated this week. Here's Gordon Ketelby.
Good evening, everyone. Right, my question is Keating correct? Will the subs deal make us the USA's puppy dog at great cost to ourselves?
Daly.
Look, I obviously came out and agreed with the former Prime Minister's sentiment in terms of the spending of the subs, $368 billion. That's a large...
And that's now, of course, that could increase.
And for an imminent threat that's supposed to be in 27 years' time. From my perspective, Australia, going back to being such a multicultural country and society, we are where we are today because of our, obviously, understanding and engagement with the Southeast Asian region and the region. So I don't understand why we don't use the knowledge, the human capital that we have here in Australia to engage and to create bridges between us and the region. I think that, and that's one part. The other part is that Australians overall are experiencing a cost of living crisis. When I was elected, I put it to the government to provide some relief for Western Sydney families, especially when it comes to petrol prices, the fuel tax. The Treasurer said to me at the time was that $3 billion was too much, that the budget couldn't take it. And rent his increases. We are witnessing the 10th rises in interest rates. So now to spend $368 billion, and on one hand, we've got, China's the biggest trading partner. We've got, what is the imminent threat? What is the most imminent threat? If it's imminent, why is it that these aid subs will be ready in 27 years' time? So it does not make sense to me, and I would like the government to be more transparent in terms of their spending on the subs, in terms of course, we all want our country to be protected. We are girt by seas. We need to have a defence policy, but we also need to have that. The defence policy is how do we tap into our cultural diversity that we have here in Australia that can actually help Australia be the leading peacemaker in the region.
I want to go to Matt on the specifics because you have raised the question, Di. But if you look at the comments of Xi Jinping in recent times, the more overt aggression towards Taiwan and saying that we will take it by force if necessary, the increased military build-up, the activities in the South China Sea and against the ruling of the Maritime Court about claiming those islands, does that not raise the threat level? Do you not accept that there is a threat?
I think there is about nearly 40% China investment in Australia in terms of mining, about 36% in terms of real estate, and we've got billions of dollars in terms of education. Students, international students come to Australia. So for me, the best way to deal with any threat around the region or with anything is actually through human-to-human diplomacy and
Can
conversations.
you do both? Is there not a need
Of
as
course
well?
you can have both, but I think in terms of the subs, I mean, I'm not obviously a sub kind of expert, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who probably have more knowledge, but in 27 years' time, what with the government spent now or proposed to spend in 27 years' time, will that technology still be, would it be obsolete?
Well, let's put that to Matt, because there are questions being raised about the expenditure. There were questions put to the Defence Minister which he wasn't exactly clear in answering on insiders about what each submarine cost. I understand you'd know that, wouldn't you? What each submarine costs?
Well, the issue about cost is really about...
Well, there's the overall
We don't
cost.
break it down by submarine.
Yeah,
because
but you do...
Because Di made the point about, and there's a lot to unpack in this, the 8 submarines that we acquire at the end, the SSN AUKUS. But before that, we acquire 3, possibly 5 Virginia-class submarines that we will be operating as Australian sovereign submarines crewed by Australians and operated by Australians and at the direction of the Australian government. We're not ceding any sovereignty here. But before that, we will also have forward rotation of American and UK submarines out of HMAS Stirling in Western Australia. With all of this, building the workshops and everything to build the submarines, being able to have the Virginia-class submarine in Australia, being able to support forward rotation, being able to build our capability to sustain all of that means a massive infrastructure build. It means the training of workforce. It means the development of industry. It means skills training and education. And so to look at what's the cost of the last submarine that rolls off the end of the production line, number 8, doesn't really... It's not really
$1 trillion,
it doesn't really matter.
Matt.
And
by
so,
the end, every defence contract goes at least 3 times.
And we're talking about
defence
something,
procurement.
and we are talking about a project that's going to be lasting over 30 years. No government's ever come forward and said, look, this is what we think this project in total, with all of the sustainment, with all of the building works, the training, the workforce development, what that would cost. When we look at the attack class that was being proposed by the previous government, they didn't incorporate any of those
Geoffrey
costs.
Robertson
So we've
made,
been
you have
very
to accept it's going to be much more than 360.
because those costs never get included when these things are announced.
But there
we
is a
are
budget,
incorporating
though, right?
that.
Like there's a budget that's set out when you do any sort of planning or forward planning within many years. Like we do it in science, we do it in business. Obviously, we do it in defence.
Yeah.
Is there not just a little compartment for, OK, they're going to cost this much?
Yeah, so we've estimated that out on average, that it'll be about 0.15% of GDP. Now, the defence budget is going to be over 2% of GDP. So we're talking about a cost that is less than 10% of our defence budget going forward. So it is not an insignificant cost. It is a significant cost. But you've also got to look at the counterfactual. We are sitting in circumstances which are the most complex set of geostrategic circumstances we've confronted since the Second World War. There is really no doubt about that. We ourselves...
So is this a preparation for war? Is that what you're saying?
No, it is about actually creating the conditions by which we are best positioned, not only for our own national security, but for the security of our region and regional stability.
Because there is an imminent threat, is that why?
Because we are seeing an arms build-up in our region.
Which you
we are
believe
seeing
is a threat to
circumstance
Australia's security?
which can be a risk to Australia's community. But Di is right about diplomacy. We don't resile or step back from diplomacy always being the first and primary lever here. We want to see peace in our region. We want to see stability in our region. And if you look at what this government, our government has done in the first 10 months, it's been all about rebuilding relationships that were cast aside and not invested in under the last government. We have reopened lines of communication, not just with our Pacific neighbours and our new neighbours.
But we know this comes with an expectation. We heard from the former US Secretary for the Navy, Richard Spencer, saying there would be an expectation that Australia would join the United States in the defence of Taiwan. Now, that's not necessary. That's not a hypothetical.
It's all too true. I mean, it was a proud moment with Albo standing there with Britain and America taking this symbolic action against authoritarianism. But then you read it was the brainchild of Scott Morrison. And given what we know about Scott Morrison's brain, we should actually...
Well, Anthony Albanese believes in it because he's followed through on that, and it does raise that question.
Look, my father was a
And
fighter pilot in the Second World War in the Pacific. by the time these submarines get on track, aren't they going to be obsolete?
I just want to stay with that idea, though, because the question, to bring it back, the question from Gordon was that does it make us there's the phrase that you used, a puppy dog at huge cost to ourselves. If we're already hearing
Absolutely
from significant,
Absolutely
but if we're hearing from significant figures that there would be an expectation that Australia would join in the defence of Taiwan were there be military action, then what does that say about our independence? Would we join in that action?
I think it's been pretty clear over the last week. There's been no shortage of opinion pundits making their view known about what they think about various elements of this project that we are embarking upon, which quite frankly is a nation-building endeavour. But the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister for Defence, could not have been clearer in his answer to that direct question yesterday when he was asked about that, which is no, there is no obligation, there is no commitment that has been made by Australia to join the United States.
But there is an expectation. We heard this from the former US Secretary of the Navy. There is expected to join in the defence of Taiwan.
People can express many different opinions. The Deputy Prime Minister of this country was very clear. There is no guarantee or commitment that has been made of that nature.
We wouldn't join in the defence of Taiwan.
That is a hypothetical because we're not even in that. That is not even a situation that currently exists.
But you're preparing just for that possibility, aren't you? That's why we're getting the submarines, for the possibility of increased military action in our region that could involve us. That's why you're doing it.
That could involve us.
But you're not buying these for a hypothetical.
There could be many different ways in which that could pan out, and we need to make sure we are best prepared. And this is about doing that.
Can I say, building nation? For me, I've always dreamt this. Australia is the United Nation. We should be leading the way in terms of with countries like the UK and the US to tell them what to do, not them telling us what to do, but to say that we've got the best talent here in Australia. The multicultural uniqueness of this country means that we can be on the world stage and actually be the negotiator. We actually can dictate to the United States and to the UK, sorry, Mr. Robertson, in terms of...
Oh, no, he's proudly Australian. Can I go to Brian, because we're talking about the Americans and we have one sitting here. How much is this discussed in the US? Did you know about AUKUS before you came here?
Yes, I did, but it's not discussed much, I have to admit. Most people in America don't really care about the conversation that we're having right here. But let me just give a little bit of perspective, which is not tied to this particular expenditure, but rather the amount of money that the world spends on defense and military is utterly mind-boggling. And if you take a step back and you say, remember that wonderful pale blue dot image where you're looking at little planet Earth through the diaphanous rings of Saturn, and you say to yourself, 10,000 years after the agricultural revolution, when we've started to make societies that barely look like the ones we have today, we're still doing the same thing that we did back then, smashing each other over the head to try to get a little tiny fraction of a pixel on this little tiny rock orbiting this nondescript star in the suburbs of an ordinary galaxy. It's insane what we're doing. So the real answer is, can't we get rid of our atavistic instincts to kill each other and just find a way to act together?
And that is a lovely idea. And that is a lovely idea.
And well, let me just say, but before you answer, I am a theoretical physicist. I'll leave the practicalities to you guys.
But my point is, that's a lovely ideal, but that's certainly not an ideal that the people of Ukraine right now could afford to be living under. And that's the reality of the circumstances we confront.
I think where Matt is right is, and when Paul Keating certainly is wrong, when he said that Penny Wong was going around with a lei around her neck, and that wasn't foreign policy. Soft power is foreign policy, and it's the most important policy that Australia has to offer. And last year, you saw it work when Chinese foreign minister went round the Pacific trying to round them up into an alliance. And they refused because, except for the Solomons, who were corrupted by the Chinese money, the politicians there. But that is what China is doing, and that is what the islands in the Pacific, thanks to Australian soft power, including the ABC. I mean, the ABC is, like the BBC in Britain, is a key to our soft power, spreading our values of democracy and rugby and so forth. But it was starved of funds, and only last year did it get from the Albanese government the money that enabled it to cover the South Pacific. So it is the soft power.
Okay. Well, we're talking a lot. We're talking a lot about war, and just picking up Brian's point about the absurdity of what we do in war, and of course there is a very human cost as well. I'd like to bring in a couple of people who have experienced this as a family. Alison and Dave Whitfield are joining us from Carina in Brisbane. Nice to have you with us.
Hi, Sam.
Dave, you served in East Timor, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And the impact has stayed with you. Could you share with us what the impact of serving there was and how you still live with that?
Okay, well, try to make it short. I have very serious dreams every night, nightmares every night. I'm in full body pain constantly. I always say even my eyelids hurt. Just the memories of a few things that happened in there. I was a medic as well. I served over there, so saw a few things and did a few things that some other people may not have done. Yeah.
I wonder how you feel, Dave.
And also probably tried to commit suicide more times than I can count, 30 plus times probably.
Alison, what's it been like for you then as a wife to see this? I mean, it's just, I'm sorry to hear you have to say that, Dave, and I'm sorry for what you've gone through, and particularly in service of our country. What's it like, Alison, in that situation?
You say wife, and if I was just a wife, it'd be good. But I am Dave's carer, counsellor, psychiatrist, psychologist, doctor,
she's my everything.
Chemist, everything.
She's my everything.
I cut him down when he's hanging from the roof. I perform CPR when he's overdosed. And I've done that many times. And until we got help from the Veterans Centre of Australia, and now that's been closed, there's nowhere for us to go. No, there is no inpatient care in Australia for disabled suicide veterans anymore.
Alison, I'm so sorry to hear you have to say that, and there's no words to even respond to what you've had to go through. I'm just wondering when you talk about no support services, that you don't have what you need, what's your question, particularly because we have a minister here tonight that you can put a question directly to?
Yeah. My question is, I'm actually offering you an invitation, Mr. Keogh, to be a guest in our home and experience firsthand the crisis resulting in your government's neglect of Australian veterans and their families by closing the Veterans Centre Australia. This is an invitation as a guest. However, it is bring your own food because DVAs and CAT payments don't pay for extra mouths other than mine and Dave's.
Really?
I'd like you to really, I don't want you to send your secretary or your offsider. I'd like you to come to our home to experience it firsthand.
Matt?
That veteran centre meant everything to a lot of veterans, and it saved a lot of veterans' lives, including Dave's. He wouldn't be sitting here now if it wasn't for that centre. And to you, he might be Joe Blow, but to me, he's my husband who signed up and served for this country, and he's everything.
Of course.
Maybe not to you, but to me he is, and he deserves better. And so do a lot of other veterans.
Matt?
Well, firstly, can I say to Alison and to Dave, and Dave, thank you for your service, and Alison, thank you for your service in looking after Dave. And as I said in the Parliament when responding to the interim report from the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide, it is really clear that governments, both sides, over a long period of time, have dropped the ball in many ways in how we support our veteran community when they're in need. And some have been very happy with the support that they've received, and great work's been done, and I know the staff of DVA are very committed to that, but it doesn't work every time.
But there's a very clear invitation made from Alison's heart here as well to you to say to come and visit, to sit down.
I'm happy to get in. I'm happy to be in touch with them, and if we can get Alison and details, then we can certainly arrange something there. But I think just to go to the Veteran Centre that was being spoken about as well, it's a really sad circumstance that's arisen there. It was a small centre working in the North Shore of Sydney, and it grew, which was great, but it didn't seem to be able to put together a sort of a sustainable funding model around it. We certainly provided quite a deal of funding, but unfortunately, it came to a circumstance where that board decided to make a decision to close, but we worked, as in the Department of Veterans Affairs, very closely with them to make sure that all of their existing client base could be connected to other appropriate services.
Well, we have two people here who are part of that.
Yep.
Is that what's happened in your case, Alison? Do you believe that you now have the services that you need after that closure?
No. Dave's last attempt, we waited 9 days for a bed to become available in an inpatient care centre. 9 days. I had to tie myself to my husband so he wouldn't have any more attempts on his life at night while we slept. I tied myself to him.
Yeah. And that reflects a...
And also, Mr. Keogh, recently you spoke at a public forum and about the crisis, and you said to write to the health minister.
What I was speaking about when I was asked about white card access was that I am engaging with the health minister about where veterans are finding a lack of service available to them, and I am working with the Department of Health and the health minister around what we need to do for those veterans that are finding difficulty in accessing a doctor that will service them under the white card. But the broader issue you've raised is a really important one, which is the Department of Veterans Affairs funds services. We will connect you to a service, we'll pay for those services, but we don't run hospitals, we don't run inpatient clinics, that is not something the government does. It's reliant upon the existence and accessibility of either state systems or private. We will pay for to go private, but we do have a broader problem across the country where there is a lack of that service. And that we see that in different parts of the country and especially in regional areas. And that is a huge problem that confronts people when they need help now, and I'm aware of that, and I'm really sorry that it's impacted the way that it has, and if we can get your details, I'm very happy to be in touch.
So as a product of the Vietnam War myself, and thank you, Alison and David, for sharing your story, I think we've just witnessed the human suffering of wars. And I think that we can't, for any government to invest, putting money aside to get us prepared to go to war, they must put aside money because there will be bound to be people like David and his wife and his family who will need that support when they come back here when you go to war. When you go to war, you see things that you don't want to see, and you do things that you don't want to do because war forces you to kill, war forces you to do the most horrendous things. So from my perspective, as government put aside this kind of money, unfathomable money, to go and prepare, they need to prepare for the human impact as well of that.
Alison, Dave, thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. And I don't know if this is even good enough, but the best of luck to you, and the love that you have for each other has really shone through tonight. Dave, thank you again for what you've done for our country, and thank you again for being able to share that story with us tonight. And hopefully we can see a better outcome. We're going to stay with this and we're going to follow this up as well. And you've had a commitment from the Minister here tonight to follow this with you. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just say as well, yes, please. Thank you. Yeah, extraordinary story of when we talk about conflict, to actually see the human cost of that and to see the impact it has is worth keeping in mind, isn't it, when we talk about numbers and submarines and preparing for war. If this discussion is raising any difficulty for you or anyone you know, the numbers for Lifeline and Open Arms are there on your screen. So please utilise those if you need. Well, if you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A. We are live with Brian Greene, Di Lee, Matt Keogh, Kirsten Banks and Geoffrey Robertson. Next, we're going to hear from Matthew Timms.
Science is all about questioning the nature of reality and, in doing so, uncovering truths. With politicians like Donald Trump inciting a riot over election fraud and Vladimir Putin rationalising a deadly conflict in Ukraine, we cannot help but think that politicians obscure reality and reformulate truths to suit their narrative. Would it be fair to say that politics has become anti-science? And if so, what is the future of science in politics?
Brian.
Well, I think it's the case that politicians have twisted reality to bend to whatever image that they have of the world and to suit their particular needs. Been doing that, for 5,000 years. So it's nothing new.
This is something as well coming from someone who deals with multiple realities. And you're talking about superstring theory with multiple dimensions and different ideas of time. That's saying something, Brian.
But here's the thing. Those crazy-sounding ideas emerge from the most rational analysis of basic mathematical equations that have been developed to describe our most precise observations and experiments about the world. They're not concocted out of a twisted imagination, and we don't build these ideas for some end beyond trying to understand the world at its deepest possible level.
It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because it goes to the idea of if this is what we're hearing in politics and the way truth is bent, what does it say about respect for science? Because we saw this during COVID, didn't we?
Oh my
the respect
God.
for science,
Yeah.
the respect for truth. What impact is that having on our community when it comes to understanding and respecting science?
Well, of course, if you have a leader that is disrespecting the most basic facts about the world, then those who follow that leader, who identify with the groups that support that leader, are going to have a similar attitude. And of course, that's exactly what we have seen. But, the bottom line is that the power of science is that it does transcend these momentary hurdles, these momentary blips, right? I mean, science will ultimately win out. There will be hurdles now and then. There will be people who try to block it, but the truth will win, and observation will win, and experiment will win, and mathematics will lead us to a deeper truth. Along the way, there will be casualties. Along the way, there will be people who try to deny it and change things for those particular aims. Those are minor eddies in the ultimate flow toward a deeper understanding of the world. We will get there, absolutely.
Kirsten, how do we get there?
Well, the thing about the world that we live in at the moment is that information is so easy to access. Whether that information is correct is another question, right? You go into TikTok, right? You go into YouTube, you go into any of the social media platforms, people are there sharing information, whether it's correct or not, whether they understand it or not, and that's okay. Sharing information is a really powerful thing. It's just when we start with the conclusion and cherry pick our data and evidence to suit that conclusion is where we get this problem. And that's where, science comes in, and it's much more fun to figure out the answer along the way.
I'm just wondering too, as a First Nations person, a Wiradjuri person, operating in science that we know comes with its own politics, comes out of its own history. Which science, whose voices are heard? As a woman, as a Wiradjuri woman, what do you bring to science that, for want of a better phrase, the old white male scientist may not? Are there different ways of seeing truth and accessing truth through science?
Absolutely. And I think the important thing is not just you have the old white males and then you have me. It's like you have all perspectives in science. And I think that's where we need to engage in more people's understandings and perspectives. I think that's what I really enjoy to do with what I do about talking about science and sharing my passion for science, is taking it from the Western science that I have learned through school, through university, but also through the beautiful Wiradjuri astronomy that we've learnt from elders and from people who are working in that space too, learning the language too, and getting that different perspective. Yindirmara, for example, it's such a beautiful
To have
word
respect.
Exactly, to go slowly, have respect. And I think that's a really important thing, to have those different perspectives, to make you think a little bit differently than what you think.
I'll just note that, Kirsten, as well, because one of the things that we see is that science is often pitted against spirituality, as if it's a sort of an arm wrestle. As Wiradjuri people, you and I are very spiritual people, and we have a connection to Barmy and God and our idea of a creator. How do you marry the spiritual and the scientific?
Well, to be honest, when it comes to Wiradjuri astronomy, they go hand in hand. Our stories of Biami, our stories of the night sky, the emu, Gogoman, there is science within those stories, and we learn lessons from those stories too. Gogoman, the dark emu, its position in the night sky indicates when is the right time for us to go looking for emu eggs. It's a seasonal calendar. The way that Biami, which for those who may not know, it's also the stars of Orion, is a more common constellation that we all generally tend to know. The way that it sets in the night sky from our perspective here in Australia matches the stories that we learn about Biami. That's beautiful. It has that spirituality in it, but also is backed by science. There is scientific understanding, keen observation of this world around us. It's intertwined. I don't think there really should be this spirituality, science separate. There are times when it should be separate, absolutely, but it's not one and the other. Similar also for others, maybe as well, religion and science. There are many religious people who are also scientists as well. It's having those different perspectives that are so, so important to make us all more well-rounded as people and as humans.
Right.
Well, the only thing I'd add to that is, and I think it's a beautiful perspective, I think the point that you made toward the end of your remark, that there are times that we do need to keep them separate. For instance, if we wanted to calculate the electric dipole moment of the electron, I think quantum electrodynamics is probably the best language to use. But if we want to understand, the meaning of what we're trying to figure out, if we're trying to get some feel for how we fit into the larger cosmological picture, then we've told many beautiful stories, and you've recounted some. And I think the deepest understanding comes from blending. For whatever issue, whatever question you have, take the best of every perspective that we have, blend them together to get the richest understanding.
Next, we have a hypothetical. We're going to put this to Geoffrey with Damien Kent.
Evening, Geoffrey.
Hi.
My question to you is, you've been selected by the International Criminal Court in The Hague to be lead counsel for the defence of Vladimir Putin on war crimes. Go.
Well,
No pressure.
Your Honours, my client is guilty. But his defence, and you understand international lawyers speak in Latin as often as they can, his defence is the tu quoque defence. I did it, but you, my prosecutors, did it too. Do you remember 20 years ago,
The Iraq War?
That was the crime of aggression, of which Putin, of course, is guilty beyond reasonable doubt. The crime of aggression was committed by the American president, by the British Prime Minister. And there was a little fellow there, popped up occasionally, not very well known, called John Howard. He committed Australia, and there were 27 casualties we suffered, not as much as the others, but he committed Australia to an assault on a state, to the crime of aggression. So that would be Putin's defence. Were I a judge, I would point out that two wrongs don't make a right, and the technical fact that the crime of aggression only entered the law, international law, in 2017. So technically, the aggression that the Allies committed was before that. But today, there is no doubt that he's guilty as charged of, we can see the pictures of Maripol, 1,000 people, children in particular, killed in the theatre. We can see pictures of the bombed buildings. Undoubtedly he knew, and the ones who did the bombing knew, that there would be civilian casualties and deaths, and they intended those deaths. And under international law, we have a doctrine called command responsibility, and which targets him as commander for not only permitting and approving these acts, but for taking no action to investigate or punish the war criminals who did it.
We should also point out that he won't stand for trial with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, because Russia is not a signatory, nor is the United States, nor is China.
Well, that's true, but it's interesting that indictment has been the prelude to the fall of Milosevic, Pinochet, Charles Taylor. I signed Charles Taylor's indictment, and we didn't get him. He ran Liberia, and then he paid enough money to stay in Nigeria until his money ran out, and then he was surrendered. He is now in prison for life in Britain. But there comes that question that Putin's moral authority will be undermined. And as well, he can't travel to 123 countries. And in time, you may see him. It took 20 years to get hold of some of the butchers of the Balkans. But in time, we may see him hobbling into a court like some old Nazi, or he may suffer a coup from his own generals, certainly if Russia suffers as much as it's currently suffering from casualties.
We're going to move on now. Thank you for that hypothetical. We're going to move on now and hear from Kate Ciseljo. Kate?
I've been in unpaid advocacy for nearly 10 years. I've sat on numerous committees and roundtables trying to fight for gambling reform as the only unpaid person in the room. I never ever thought that this is what I'd be doing at 43, but at 18, I never thought I would be impacted by gambling harm for over 12 years. I stepped into advocacy after nearly taking my life in 2012, and I want to know why it's the responsibility of unpaid advocates to try and control the gambling industry, an industry that government and regulators are paid to be controlling. I want to know why, as the nation experiencing the most gambling harm than any other nation, is this public health crisis not a top priority?
Matt?
Well, from the Commonwealth point of view, we are doing a review at the moment into online gambling, which is the bit that we regulate, and also obviously there's the concerns in looking at the issue around advertising of gambling. They're the two areas that the Commonwealth has a responsibility and is able to regulate. And one of the things, of course, that has been found by countries that have banned online gambling is people just find other ways of getting to other online sources of gambling. That is always a difficulty in this space. When we're confronted in terms of in-person, whether that is via the whole myriad of different options that are presented to people, I have to say, very proudly a Western Australian that is a state that has a bipartisan position against pokie machines, and I think that has served Western Australia very well and certainly reduced harm. Obviously, we still have a casino, we still have other forms of gambling. It's not to say there's no harm.
Why is it so difficult for politicians to stand up to the gambling lobby? I think I was reading Dominic Perrottet, New South Wales Premier, who's trying to confront this issue, said that there are four arms of government: the state, the federal, the state, the local, and the gambling industry. Why is it so powerful?
Not being from New South Wales, I'm not really well positioned to answer that.
Darlene?
Look, from my perspective, obviously they've been around for a long time, and you know, when we're talking about gambling, Fairfield City, where I'm a member representing the seat of Fowler, we've got probably the highest problem gambling in the Southern Hemisphere, and the amount of gambling that Australia's got, it's all concentrated in our little area, which has 70% population non-English speaking background.
And it touches so many people. I mean, it touched. I think you're
absolutely,
fair to share
and
that
like
touched
yours,
a member
Kate,
of your own family.
you know, my own family member. You know, obviously problem gambling in the family, and it caused a lot of mental health issues, and it's very hard because it's you know, you're dealing with that day in, day out, and especially from a non-English speaking background of community, people who have problem gambling do not identify themselves as having a problem with gambling, and therefore to seek any help has been very challenging as well.
But would you want it banned? Would you be re-elected by your constituents?
Look, I don't think banning anything, it's going to just go underground from my perspective. Is how do we manage it and how do we engage? I mean, clubs in my area, unfortunately or fortunately, create jobs. And jobs is what keeps our economy, local economy, going around.
The city was full of two-up schools before people could gamble.
So basically, where do you know? It's a tightrope that I think you have to
What
walk.
do you think, Kate? Where should it be? Where should that line be drawn? As someone, and you've shared your own experience tonight, and thank you for having the courage to do that. But it had a huge impact on your own life. You look at that and you hear the story that Di spoke about her own family member. Where should that line be drawn?
Right now, we're not even in the same playing field. People don't understand. You use the term problem gambler. That's an industry term. This is addiction by design, and people are experiencing gambling harm. Saying problem gambler is cultivating shame and stigma, which keeps people silent. The shame is on the perpetrators of the harm. They've known full well the impacts.
Did you feel that you were preyed upon?
Absolutely.
Did you feel that?
There was no education or awareness around the harms of gambling like there were alcohol and drugs when I was at school.
I think that is important. I mean, my grandfather was the secretary of the Dapto Dogs, which was a mark of great distinction in the Wollongong area. But I've never placed a bet in my life because he educated me about how the bank always wins and what a mug's game it is. And I think we've got to get that across to children who are battered at age 12, 13 by all the inducements for sports bet.
And it's everywhere.
Yeah. Of course.
You watch TV. Look, I'm the only Zoomer who still watches actual TV. But like, you see these ads all the time. Every single ad break there's a sports bet ad. Every single ad break there is a betting ad. But even where people my age and younger are consuming their content online, it's still there too.
But the clubs always say, oh, we do a lot of work in the community. You go to the New South Wales Art Gallery, New Extension, half of it is funded by poker machine producers. Now,
okay, so what education are they doing? Are they doing art education or gambling education?
They are doing community service. But in Europe now, we're coming towards...
percent of
Kate,
what they take.
Thank you again for sharing that, and thank you for the conversation. It's obviously something that we're hearing a lot about in the lead up to the New South Wales election, and obviously something we can revisit on the program as well. If this discussion is raising any difficulties for you or anyone you know, we had these numbers up earlier, we'll put them up again, the numbers for Lifeline, and the National Gambling Helpline here as well on your screen. We did put this question earlier. We're going to bring you the results of our online poll now. We asked, should gambling be illegal in Australia? Here's how you voted. Yes, 48, no, 47. There you go, completely split on this. Yeah, food for thought. We're going to move on now and take a question from Ryan Holmes, right?
Yeah, thank you, Stan. I want to circle back to Kirsten, a question predominantly for yourself. It's clear that developments such as your own focus on an understanding of space and life beyond Earth will it be possible that in the lifetime people here now will be able to visit, irrespective of price?
I sure hope so. It's a very exciting thing, exploring, right? And exploring the great unknown in space is the biggest exploration we can really do. Except maybe some will argue the ocean is also one that we can do too, but we've already talked about the ocean today. Let's talk about space. But we go
More
back.
submarines.
Yeah. Only space submarines. Actually, that's a great point. We are sending a submarine, in essence, to Jupiter's moon Europa, for example, to explore if there's life underneath the icy crust of this moon. We had an exciting moment a couple of years ago where we thought we found phosphine on Venus, a chemical that is a biosignature, something that we look for that only is produced through animals, through biological processes on Earth. And if we find it on Venus, like, oh, maybe there's something out there that's potentially producing this.
Do you believe that we will?
Not the thing.
Do you believe we will, Kirsten? Do you believe that inevitably there is life elsewhere and that we will, not only that life is elsewhere, that we will discover that?
Let's put it this way. When you look out into space at the tiniest speck of the sky and stare at it for 11 days for Hubble, but only a couple hours for JWST, you see thousands upon thousands of galaxies with billions of stars in them and then billions of planets. Like Brian said before, we're on a pretty average rock, orbiting around an aggressively average star. Surely there is something else out there. But now the question comes to be, will we find life out there? And even so, more excitingly, maybe intelligent life too.
Well, along those lines, there's a famous quote of Einstein's that I love, where Einstein said there are only two things that might be infinite: space and human stupidity. And he said he wasn't sure about space. So if we could find life and intelligent life, what I would like to know is, are they as stupid as we are?
The James Webb Telescope as well, what opportunities does that raise for us?
Oh, it's huge. The clarity and resolution of the images are allowing us to understand galaxies and
we just saw a star dying, didn't we?
Absolutely. We're seeing things that we've never been able to see before. And you know, I know we're almost out of time, but one point that's really important to quickly make: life on planet Earth has a beautiful unity. DNA is how all life stores information. The same process is how all life mines for energy. The question is there another way that life could exist? And that's what we could learn by finding other examples. Is it always the same, or can it happen in many different ways?
Because that's the difficult part of that question, is like, we only know of life that we know it is right here. But yeah, could it be different? We're not sure of those sorts of biosignatures that may be different.
Let's bring us right back down to earth now, back to politics. Here's Maddie Jury.
Good evening. My question is the political cycle long enough to create leaders that think about the future?
Yes or no, Geoffrey? There you go.
Not with 8 years in power, but we don't want them to have any longer in power. Look, we have a day where a couple of days ago Vladimir Putin was indicted. Tomorrow, Donald Trump says he's being indicted. Does that mean, Brian, that there is a God?
Only if he's convicted.
Yes or no, Matt? I mean, you've
3 years is too short. We should move to fixed 4-year terms at a federal sphere, like all the states have clarity about what the date is that we hold elections. Everyone can plan around it. It will give more breadth for governments to think.
I agree. 3 years is not enough. You get in and then you start discussing things and then you go on to election already.
Depends who's in office, I suppose you'll say, Brian.
No, I would say that I think in terms of billions of years, so none of this.
A physicist's answer to a political question. Thank you, Maddie. That's all we have time for. Please thank our panel again: Brian Greene, Di Lee, Matt Keogh, Kirsten Banks and Geoffrey Robertson. Thank you for sharing your questions. Thank you again for sharing your stories tonight. I think we got a glimpse into how other people struggle with so many things, and the things that we can often talk about in quite a blasé way. land with real consequences for people. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that vulnerability with us. Next week, we're live again from Sydney. And joining me, South Australian Premier Peter Malinauskas, Country Liberal Senator for NT Jacinta Price, and Greens Senator for WA, Jordan Steele-John. Former Secretary of the US Navy, we talked about him tonight, Richard Spencer. So we're going to be going back to AUKUS again next week. Head to our website to register to be in the audience. Until then, thank you again. Have a good night.